They were wrestling with legacy Cisco unified communications infrastructure, and they said this is becoming too much to manage with a limited IT staff. Direct routing is like trying to manage a spider web. Each customer has their own individual strand into team, their own SIP connectivity into teams. There's a lot of PowerShell code to get it up and running. You really have to understand coding in order to configure this thing. It creates this research point for a customer. You end up with a cost imbalance because vendors still have to operate legacy infrastructure that fewer and fewer people are using now. I've already got the M and the V figured out. I've got Teams. Voice isn't dead. It's just not a product anymore. It's a feature in a platform.
All right, so tell me about Rosemond. What, I mean, university education, how many users, how, distributed, one location, campus? Like, give me a little bit of background.
Yeah, so Roseman University is a multi-campus facility based in, I believe they're in Nevada. I'd have to look it up. But ultimately, they were wrestling with legacy Cisco unified communications infrastructure, and they kind of reached a breaking point where they said this is becoming too much to manage with a limited IT staff. Years and years and years ago, they made the same decision that a lot of organizations did when they were looking at on-prem of legacy PBX versus Cisco was the new name on the block.
Mhm.
So, nobody ever got fired for buying Cisco. So a lot of organizations bought those UCs or the UCMs and deployed them. And the reality of operating a standalone on-premise phone system multiplied and compounded across multiple campuses, it was too much to manage for their IT staff. The costs were escalating because they were at end of life for the infrastructure they were on. So they were going to have to invest in hardware. They were going to have to invest in licensing. And ultimately, they weren't seeing the value from just a phone on a desk. So what we talked to them about was leveraging their investments in Office 365. And because they're in higher education, they were able to actually access dramatically discounted licensing to upgrade to the A5E5, which gave them the phone system license. And then we were able to give them, the calling entitlements. They're using our text messaging partner ClerkChat to enhance student services and alumni outreach with text. And ultimately, the value of a centralized cloud-based model has proven itself in cost, in operational efficiency, and also in innovation across the campus. One of the biggest stats that I think is interesting with them is that they had roughly 700, 800 some odd IP phones that they wanted to retire out of the infrastructure. They were Cisco IP, so they could convert them to SIP. And the approach that they took with reluctant faculty, we'll use that term, right, was just give this a shot for 90 days. Use a soft phone. And what they kind of knew, what the administration knew there was you're all using your desk phones in speakerphone mode in a closed office. So there's not really a need to have a dedicated appliance on your desk when you can just do that through your computer. So they took 700 of these phones, they took them off the desks, they gave them the reluctant faculty soft clients, and only 70% of, or 70 phones, not 70%, but so roughly about 90% of them said, nah, I'm good. You're right. This is not such a big issue. And they were able to repurpose the hardware for those that didn't. So it wasn't a case of, we made this decision. Now I've got to go out and invest in new infrastructure. Some of the standards-based work that the industry's been working on for the past 20 years really starts to shine in this type of an environment, because with SIP, you don't have these throwaway investments, and there's a lot of key benefits. There's financial benefits, there's environmental benefits. We're not putting, all these pieces of plastic out in a landfill somewhere. We're still, squeezing more usable life out of them. So it was a really interesting stat for me, and the way that they chose to kind of roll the solution out to minimize that disruption to the university's operations across multiple campuses was another really interesting eye opener for me on, how they gained adoption, how they were able to roll this out and see success.
Did they have a dedicated telecom team going into this, or was the IT team already responsible and managing the CCM platform. So it was as one shot.
It was the latter. So their
Okay.
IT team was managing the Cisco unified communications infrastructure in addition to all the other, IT infrastructure that they supported. So it was like I said, the overhead was becoming onerous for them because it wasn't just one system; they had multiple systems across different campuses.
Since the advent of Teams and Teams Voice, and then what became direct routing, and we've been through lots of iterations now, right?
Hmm.
Microsoft is still iterating on this platform pretty significantly. I think what surprised me more than anything else is just how many different approaches and perceptions or goals people really look at this infrastructure with, and now it's becoming this, or at least from my seat, where I never really know when I'm walking in what kind of outcome we're going to get to, because maybe there's a perception that they want to, there's some driver, there's a perception, there's some goal, there's some thought process, and as you work deeper and deeper into it, other things always come out. Like, you mentioned phones on desks, right? Do they want to maintain phones on desks? Meeting room appliances, what does that look like? It's almost like an organization by organization now has a lot more options of what can they deliver and what where they want to go and what they want to get out of it, right? Like it's this one size fits all isn't really the case anymore, and it's interesting how this is playing out.
Yeah, and I think the problem Microsoft has is they've created, to use the analogy, there's one destination. I want to turn on calling in Teams because I see the benefits across, cost efficiencies. I see the benefits on productivity gains because my users aren't juggling all the apps, and I see the benefits and innovation. To your point, they're iterating on the Teams platform itself, and new innovations like Copilot and now Copilot agents.
Mhm.
That's where innovation's happening in communications, is on these cloud-based platforms, whether it's Teams in this case with Roseman, or Zoom, or even Cisco WebEx. And the challenge Microsoft has had, and I think they're relatively unique in this space because Zoom's story is much cleaner, is that they've created a lot of different ways to get to that destination.
Mhm.
So if you're using a GPS, it's going to give you, this is the direct route, but then there's like these other side routes if you want to go on the little side quest, so to speak, right? Direct routing, operator connect, direct routing as a service, they're all basically the same thing. It's getting voice. They're all leading to the same outcome for the end customer. There may be slightly, different spins on the ball, depending on which one you choose. But ultimately, it's the destination is what most customers are looking for. Like, Roseman University was looking to enable Microsoft as their collaboration platform, as their full collaboration, including calling and, text messaging, digital comms. And how they turn that on didn't really matter, but it creates this research point for a customer, because they say customers do about 70% of the research before they reach out to a trusted advisor to get more information. It's another kind of needless obstacle for a customer to try and figure out, like, all right, what's the difference? Like, what's the difference between operator connect, direct routing? And you know
Let's talk about it. I mean, this is a great, like let's go off of this tangent a little bit, right?
Sure.
Because okay, so Microsoft is unbundling Teams
Hmm.
as a directive, right? So now we have to compute what the actual cost of the team seat is on the
Hmm.
desk, and presumably people are invested enough in Teams that Teams doesn't leave. It's just they have to add now this cost of Teams to it.
Correct.
So then you decide you want to go into Teams Voice.
Hmm.
So you have to buy the PBX license. It's either in your bundled, if you're on the right tier, you get it. If not, you have to license the PBX component.
Correct.
And this, I think this was a big surprise for a long time for a lot of people because Microsoft has decreased the cost of the PBX license, but it used to be very expensive to
Hmm.
enable to actually just to purchase the PBX component. Okay, so you've committed to Teams, you've licensed Teams, you've committed to Teams Voice, you've licensed the PBX, right? And now you have four paths to the PSTN. You can purchase licensing directly from Microsoft,
Hmm.
the PSTN connectivity. If you haven't done that, I'm just telling you right now, don't do it. Um, we can talk about that more. But then you rattled off three, right? Direct routing, operator connect, and direct routing as a service.
So direct routing was first, and it was designed as a way to bridge on-premise infrastructure into Teams. It was really before a pure cloud environment was really seen, and it was designed to kind of address that you know healthy middle of customers that are going to live in a hybrid world for a time. The problem with direct routing is it's a bit of a science experiment. And I mean that in the most loving way possible, but it is like for a provider like us, direct routing is like trying to manage a spider web, because each customer has their own individual strand into team, their own SIP connectivity into team. You've got to manage their dial plan uniquely on their environment. It's very intensive work to get it up and running. Now, companies like SIPPIO said, there's not really a need to keep your infrastructure on premise if you want to move to Teams. And the way to do that in a pure cloud infrastructure-less environment was where direct routing as a service was born. So the only difference between direct routing and direct routing as a service at the time was, instead of the carrier service going to your site and then you building a link to Teams, us as a provider, we would build a link to Teams from our data centers to Teams, and then you just buy dial tone service from us. So essentially it was two sides of the same coin. Direct routing as a service. It was basically just an operational model. Instead of having the infrastructure on site, I'm just subscribing to a company like SIPPIO. And one of the things that we did early on in the direct routing as a service model was we realized we wanted to deliver some speed, some simplicity, and some flexibility to the product. So one of the first things that we did in order to enhance reliability is we were an early adopter of what's called derived trunking. So basically, instead of a million links to, the Microsoft Azure environment for each customer one by one, we built one big pipe into Teams, and we had everybody running in our production environment over that one pipe. So that gave us some stability. It gave us some speed. The other thing that we did with direct routing and direct routing as a service, and this is part of the reason why I say it's a bit of a science experiment, is there's a lot of PowerShell code to get it up and running. You really have to understand coding in order to, configure this thing. And that meant a lot of professional services to get it up and running. One user required 2 lines of code. So, scale that out. It doesn't scale. So, for 100 users, you're looking at 200 lines of code. For 1,000 users, 2,000 lines of code that you're just key whacking. So we went and built a voice panel so that it turned all of the code into a graphic user interface, 6 clicks, and you're ready to go. You could manage your numbers inside of our application and push those into Teams tenant, because at the time there was no place in Microsoft Teams Admin Center to manage phone numbers. So it really kind of tried to make a complicated solution a little bit more elegant. Think of it kind of like the, way cell phones used to be. And then when Apple basically said, no, you've got one home button. That was really where we were trying to aim for, was to make this, kind of simple and easy. But at the end of the day, it still was a challenge from a supportability perspective, because if there was no reference architecture to direct routing. So when Microsoft makes a change on the Teams platform, it potentially could create cascading issues, because now all of a sudden, customers were offline because their links went down or whatnot. So Microsoft announced Operator Connect, and this was what we've lovingly called Direct Routing 2.0. And we loved it because it introduced the idea of a reference architecture. In order to be an operator in the Operator Connect marketplace, you have to actually go through a full audit of technology and business model and everything else. So for us, it created a sustainable solution. Fun fact, we actually failed our first audit with Microsoft because we lived in Azure. And the prescriptive approach for integrating, because every other carrier was outside of Azure and offsite colos, was that you have to go through maps. Microsoft Azure peering service. You couldn't just do an IPsec VPN in or anything else. And we're like, guys, we are neighbors. We don't need to go through maps. That's like basically saying I'm going to plug the fridge in the kitchen, but instead of plugging into the socket that's there, I got to walk out the house with an extension cord, come through the front house, or come through the front door, and then plug it in using the extension cord. Like, once we got the two sides talking, all of a sudden it was like, oh, this is actually pretty elegant. We're running with this. So we've been Azure native since the very beginning, and that's been a value to us. because, being next door neighbors.
Does Microsoft still force the SBC selections as part of that reference architecture?
Yes.
In the beginning, it was like service providers had to have, it was like, here's your list. You could be A, B, C, D, or E, or whatever that they
Mhm.
had certified. So they still okay.
Yeah, so there's still supported infrastructure on that front. Again, trying to create some stability here.
Mhm.
And then in the Operator Connect marketplace, when Microsoft is going to make a change on an API, it's cascaded down to the operator. So we have time to, kind of prepare, adjust for it. So it's a much more, reliable solution. But at the end of the day, it's another route to that same destination of I want to turn on calling in Teams. So, where does the actual the network operations come from, the PSTN? How do you connect it in? This is all behind the curtain stuff that we wrestle with, but the customers don't need to because the customers aren't looking to buy Operator Connect or direct routing. They're not products. They're routes to a destination. And
Now,
that's
there's
really
still
where I think they've kind of tried to clean this up with Operator Connect. They're obviously trying to drive more of the traffic through the Operator Connect program. But to your point, they still have calling plans out in the market, and direct routing is still out there for those hybrid customers. So
there's still, I mean, I was gonna say, there's still examples of people and reasons why you would end up on direct routing.
Mhm.
But that's, I mean, the main use case I can think of is probably contact center applications or call recording. Things like this where it actually requires a different voice architecture of how the voice traffic gets pinned through the service provider to Teams and vice versa, right?
Even that's starting to change. I mean, honestly, we have partners that we do call recording with and such, and we run those over our Operator Connect pipe. So it's even that stuff starting to change. The main driver that's going to drive somebody to direct routing still really is I'm going to operate in this hybrid environment where I need to keep my prem PBX for all or part of my users. And a
Mhm.
lot of times that's because of a contact center. But I want the UC users on Teams, but I want the contact center to, kind of live on the legacy PBX. A direct routing solution would be the bridge to that.
Okay.
So that's where you still see it. Some of the Operator Connect um, program doesn't extend as far globally as we operate. So we operate 82 countries. So some areas we're still using direct routing as a service because we just don't have access to offer Operator Connect in certain markets.
Something that I struggle with, of course, Microsoft has created a very large platform and a very large ecosystem. So you have a very large TAM, a
Hmm.
lot of users, big addressable market, which then creates a situation where everybody and their neighbor shows up and says, "Hey, you know, we do this, right?
Yeah.
Give us money." Which creates a second level of confusion, right? Because you start with the okay, what do we need to do to voice enable Teams? Okay, we have to do these steps. Okay, then how do we voice enable Teams? We're doing direct routing as a service, Operator Connect, right?
Hmm.
And then it's like, who do we voice enable Teams with? And this becomes complicated because there's a lot of people saying that they're really good in this space, and there's a lot of legacy players that are, of course, trying to transition, and there's other people that you wouldn't even consider that are voice enabling Teams now and saying, hey, you can run our. How do people make sense of this? Like, as a you know I mean, in this case, right, Roseman University, if you've got 1,000-ish users that you
Hmm.
want to put onto this platform, how do you even begin to approach this market and decide who's going to be a good partner for me here?
Yeah, and I think some of it is looking at, to your point, the legacy folks. There's a
Mhm.
lot of folks that built a full Teams competitor 2020 on, because everybody needed something right away. Microsoft was relatively in its infancy with Teams. I remember back when in early 2020, when I got invited to a Teams meeting at the time, I'm like, oh, you can only see four people on screen at once. And, and Zoom was
Mhm.
just so much more elegant at the time.
Mhm.
But Microsoft really leaned in on the innovation and has grown the platform to be pretty robust at this point. Um, but what that's done in its wake is it's created a lot of businesses that are built to serve message video phone. I used to work for a company that partnered with one that sold it in the marketplace. And what I would find when I would talk to customers and I'd be trying to kind of talk about, my message video phone solution, I'd run into a brick wall of the customer going, well, that's nice, but I just need the P. I've already got the M and the V figured out. I've got Teams. How does
Yeah.
this work with Teams? And it creates a challenge because, a lot of the differentiation of, hey, look at my messaging solution, look at my video solution goes out the window. And now it's just a dial tone based, sell. And it really becomes kind of trying to smack a square peg into a round hole. And you end up with a cost imbalance, because at the end of the day, those vendors still have to operate, a legacy infrastructure that fewer and fewer people are using now. Whereas a modernized solution, whether it's through us or, like a Microsoft calling plan or whatnot, we like to say we're the cheese for Microsoft's hamburger. And we don't mean that and Zoom's hamburger, by the way. But we don't mean that in a derogatory way. We mean that more to kind of frame up that we know what we are in the market, and we deliver, cost value based services that are fit for purpose and add to what you already have. So I think one of the first things that creates a fork in the road when somebody's looking at different vendors is that experience. Is this person talking to you about how they integrate with Teams, but then circling it back to how you use their platform? A lot of these guys have like, hey, I've got an app for Teams and it's great, but then it pops up my app when I make an outbound call. It's like, yeah, that's not kind of what I'm looking for here.
Right.
And then once you start looking at kind of the modernized solution providers that are delivering cloud calling or cloud communications for these platforms, Teams, Zoom, WebEx, the next step is who fills the most gaps, because there are gaps in these platforms. Text messaging is one of them. Microsoft's trying to start getting, a way to fill it. Contact center is another. Customer engagement, just in general. So not everybody needs a contact center. Fax, if you believe it or not, there's still a lot of people that need fax.
See plenty of it.
And none of that stuff is native to the Teams platform. Zoom has more of it native, but even then it's still, kind of lacking in some places. So, the next kind of decision point of how you separate suppliers is who's going to give me the best cost, but also give me the best solution. Who's going to give me the text messaging, the WhatsApp business support, the fax, to really give me a more encompassing solution versus somebody going in saying, hey, I just want to give you some voice. I just want to give you some, dial tone. That's commodity. I'm going to cut that. It's just a price-based decision. But increasingly what we're hearing from customers, and Roseman was one of them, is I need more than just a phone system. I need a communications platform,
Mm-hmm.
and I need it to operate within this platform. You know what I mean? So it's platform within a platform, if you want to think of it that way.
I succumbed to weaker impulses a couple years ago and got into an argument with somebody at Microsoft about SMS around why aren't you supporting text messaging inside of Teams natively? If I'm hoping that at some point in the future this video is going to feel really outdated, right? Because it's going to like Microsoft's going to have it. But right now and in the years that Teams been on the market before now, if you want to have text messaging into a Teams native voice environment, you have to have another app running inside of Teams in order to get to it, right? Like it's and Microsoft.
So Microsoft, to their credit, has taken steps here. So they just launched SMS
Fantastic.
inside of Teams. It's only available for Microsoft calling plans. It's going to be available for operators like myself to deliver shortly. But even then, it's limited. And what happens if you want to send a multimedia message, like a picture? Can't do it. So even then, it's still there's still tremendous value in kind of having that built into Teams. It's a Teams admin. It's an elegant solution because I've got a plug-in within Teams. It's not a separate app that I got to juggle and everything else. So I'm still keeping everything consolidated into a super app type model.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, this is still a weakness on the Microsoft side. And text messaging is a bear, with 10 DLC registration.
Yeah.
That is a challenge. And for Microsoft, who hasn't always offered the best, end customer support. It's one of the reasons you run away from calling plans. If you love email support, they're the one for
Oh,
you.
oh,
10 DLC gets really complicated over that type of an email structure.
look, Microsoft is very clear that they do not want you using their calling plans.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've used their calling plan and you ever have a support issue, you learn this lesson very quickly.
So they've also given operators like SIPPIO a backdoor API. So if a customer is on a calling plan and they want to move to an operator like SIPPIO, we can do that almost in 24 hours. We obviously don't try to do that for every single one of them, but
Yeah.
if we had to move somebody quick, we can actually move them in 24 hours because Microsoft is creating the infrastructure to do that. So take that for what you will. The fact that they're making it easy for operators like us to transition customers from those calling plans, I think, is an interesting tell strategy wise.
Team stability and outages are still a pretty significant issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, just the sheer number of people on teams at this point makes any issue within teams a significant issue. But then if you've got an organization and you're bringing your voice communication into teams as well, like, and you have teams outages, that's a consideration. And um, what is the Microsoft story around this now? Like, if we have, local survivability is always a factor. And if you're thinking about, certain things, right, access to 911, emergency services dialing, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's pretty important. Largely enterprises like this, just statistically, you're going to have more likelihood of events taking place.
Sure.
You don't want those events to take place when Microsoft Teams is off. You also have in certain jurisdictions, US specifically, let's say you have requirements that not only are you encoding the address now, but you have to encode the specific location within that address, right? What
Mm-hmm.
what what floor, what room, what suite, what area. There's requirements that you also signal your own console internally, right? Like somebody's called 911
Mm-hmm.
from this location inside of your building. You have to be able to notify somebody in your location, like, hey, this has happened. So, um, these weren't native Microsoft platform things, right? Like
No.
this is also driven mostly by service providers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So our platform, we offer a seat of Intrado with every seat that we push out to address that need from an E911 perspective. So everything's fully compliant in the U.S. with Kerry's Law and Ray-Baum Act. To broaden that out, Microsoft's come a long way on the downtime issue. Now they offer a 5 nines SLA on Teams phone, so you're talking about 5 minutes of unexpected downtime per year, contractually with the platform. Everybody's got outages. One of the industry leaders in UC had a major outage earlier this year that I think lasted for almost 24 hours. So, and they have a 5 nines SLA. So at the end of the day, there's some of this that's unavoidable no matter who you choose. In the past, Teams had its issues. I think their SLA was around 4 nines, not more than 2 years ago. So this is a relatively new thing. They announced it last year at Enterprise Connect that they had upgraded to a 5 nines SLA, and it's been pretty rock solid for us since. But that said, there are backup options, and I think some of what's available with Microsoft is actually really interesting. You've got the on-site, options with, local gateways from, companies like Audio Codes and others that can cover off on the basics around, outbound calling, E911, but also fixed mobile convergence, with Teams Phone Mobile and solutions like ours. Your cell phone becomes your Teams number. So in that environment, if Teams is having a hiccup, your cell phone still operates. You can still make an outbound call to 911 using the cellular network. So it's an environment where your cell phone almost replaces your desk phone, which is what we've been talking about for, gosh, 20, 30 years. And
Let's dig into this a little bit because I don't think a lot of people understand what this is
Mhm.
and what this actually means, right?
Sure.
Because you've got for a long time we've had the option of having an app actually on
Mhm.
the phone and you could open the app and use the app on your phone. Fixed mobile convergence is a little different. So I'm going to let you dig in,
Yeah.
I
So
want to steal your thunder here.
let's wind it back even farther. So let's jump in the time machine, the DeLorean, back to 2000, 2005. Before the advent of the smartphone and apps, there were features SimulRing or EC500 on the Avaya stuff for twinning, where incoming calls to my work phone number rang simultaneously or near simultaneously on my cell phone. And it was like magic. I remember the first time I had it, I'm like, this is amazing. The problem was when you call out to someone, because then they're getting your cell phone number and their
Two different
caller
caller
ID.
IDs.
And once they have your cell phone number, they
Yep.
never call your desk phone number anymore.
Nope.
Because I don't know if you're at your desk, but I know your cell phone is always within a 3-foot radius of you, right? So then with apps, now all of a sudden I can do voice over IP using my business phone line, no matter where I am, by simply opening the app, using the dial pad and making that outbound call. And it works. But the problem is human behavior is still stuck in when I open my cell phone and I need to make a phone call.
I just
I
dial the
don't
phone
open the
number.
Teams app
Yep.
necessarily by habit. I open the dial pad app and I call the number, thus breaking this whole illusion of this is my business number. So what fixed mobile convergence or Teams Phone Mobile and SIPPIO Mobile by Tango Networks does is basically your cell phone is your Teams phone number. So when you have an incoming call, if you're at your desk, it's going to ring on your Teams client. It's also going to ring simultaneously on your cell phone, just like Twinning did. But when you make an outbound call, you don't have to do anything with apps. You just open up your phone, you click the phone icon. You can do it one of two ways. You could actually have a personal line and a business line. So if you want to have that personal business split, or you can just unify it. So my cell phone number is my Teams phone number. It's a business phone. It's almost like an IP phone if you want to think of it that way. And when you make an outbound call using your cell phone, on the far end, the customer sees your business phone number. So when they call you back, it's going to ring wherever you happen to be logged in or whatever you're using and on your cell. And if you don't answer, then it goes to your corporate voicemail where you get, speech to text, you get voicemail to email, you can get a whole lot of other, capabilities to it. So it really is where we're finally merging the cellular device with your unified communications as a service. And then the final benefit is because I'm using voice over LTE instead of voice over internet, I can actually do a little bit better quality of service. So that it will be more reliable. It'll sound a little bit better versus doing voice over, 4G data, which can be dodgy.
It's, I mean, man, it's so obvious when you take a step back and you say at the same time we've been waiting for 20 plus years for somebody to roll this out in a meaningful way, right? I know two other carriers that do this
Mm-hmm.
out of over 100 that we keep tabs on,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like and this is US specific, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But and um like this is one of those things where it's like I was in a conversation this weekend, and without going into the details, like my answer to them was like, just have two cell phones. Like I can give you so many solutions, and they're all like fun tech nerd stuff to do, and there's lots of different ways you can do this, but like just get a second cell phone. Just
Yeah.
carry a second cell phone.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it's the simplest things are the nicest things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the I want let's this was a good tangent. I want to get back to Roseman here.
Sure.
Um, as you said, like the buyer's journey now, 70% of the time they've already done most of the research before you get engaged,
Mm-hmm.
right? So at this point, Roseman has pretty much decided like we've looked at the cost of renewals for CUCM. Maybe they looked at, I mean, they don't call it HCS anymore now. It's Cisco WebEx
Yep.
something 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 something. Cisco's been rebranding this product a bunch of times. They decided not to go to Cisco's voice cloud. I'm going to use all the marketing acronyms I hate the most. They decided not to go to Cisco's WebEx cloud calling,
Correct.
platform and wanted to integrate and go native inside of Teams. And probably around this point is when you guys got engaged. How but I would also assume that you're not the only company that they had engaged at this point to try to figure out how to deliver voice services into Teams.
So
What?
we actually didn't get engaged at this stage. This happened before we were involved with them. So the main driver that led them to choose Teams as the platform, this was a kind of a decision tree that happened before we were even brought to Roseman. Um, the main driver was incumbency. The university had adopted Teams across campus.
Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of a no-brainer for them that I'm just going to keep using what I use, because ultimately we want to minimize the impact to the end user community as much as possible. And Roseman is a great example of this. We've got another one on our website that talked about, kind of the ability to pivot quickly because they were using an incumbent platform. It's gone are the days of like setting up phone system training where, somebody comes
Right.
in a conference room and sets up a bunch of phones around a table and, you got to sit for
How
it
do
an
you
hour.
connect your voicemail? How do you say it? Yeah.
How do I transfer a call? How do I park a call?
Yeah.
So they made the decision to go to Teams absent us. They had a trusted advisor that they were working with. It was a Microsoft MVP. Once they kind of realized Teams is the answer because we're already using it, they engaged with their trusted advisor, and they were the ones that actually brought us to the table. And we were actually the only solution they ended up having to look at from a pricing perspective. It was the trusted advisor bringing us to the table, saying, "All right, if this is the route we're going, these are the guys you want to do it with." And we were able to really kind of win that business pretty quickly because the snowball was already 90% down the hill. The customer knew what they wanted. The customer knew there was going to be Teams. The credibility that the trusted advisor brought to us by bringing us to the table made it a fit. And then, obviously we came in with really aggressive pricing and won the deal by showing how quickly we could operate. Literally, I think we turned on 5 seats before we left the first meeting because our platform's fully automated. So I can literally turn on something faster and you can sign up for Netflix.
They, I've been, I've been involved with the voice with telco for a really long time.
Mm-hmm.
And um, what's been really interesting watching this current wave, I wouldn't really call it like I mean, Gartner wants to brand it like unified communications, right? But really like this current like cloud wave is this disconnect and of pricing models and push, right? So you go back to like the 2000s, even early 2010s, 20, I guess 2000s and 2010s, and you had to do all this like math around like, your Erlang calculation and how many trunks you needed per space on, number of users based on what the kind of call flow was, right? So this is relatively disconnected. I mean, I'm not sad that people don't have to think about this
Mm-hmm.
anymore because it was annoying. But there was, but we also used to have this math around like the average enterprise user, was 600 minutes a month worth of call traffic, right? Now, average enterprise user is not using 600 minutes of call traffic anymore. But I see a lot of pricing models where you come into it and you're saying, oh, we want $20 a seat, $25 a seat. We're going to give you named users, and there's this huge delta. And I think and the other thing I've noticed with enterprises, especially when you start talking about like these like legacy incumbent carriers that are trying to stick to existing pricing models, it also creates a lot of friction for a buyer, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
this is even without talking about like international. I mean, international is another like you know can of worms we should open up here, but
Sure.
just from like a domestic US calling plan, like the actual voice consumption shifts a lot. Like when you go onto Teams, like are you making phone calls as much as you're making video calls? Where's your default pattern behavior shifting to?
So it's an interesting subject, and it's one that we've talked about a lot. And you're right. Voice, inbound, outbound PSTN calling, calling
Mhm.
external parties is down in Teams. I would also say we're still making business phone calls. If you widen the aperture up and you look at the average user, they still make business phone calls. It's just where they make them has changed. Most people, their phone system is this thing, your cell phone, right?
Mhm.
Like this is how I communicate. The problem is it's disconnected from your corporate infrastructure. So if you are in a compliance environment where I need to do call recording, if you are in like at Roseman in a student services environment where, students are still calling in for assistance with financial aid, with, mental health services, with, a variety of different needs. uh, the main channel is when something's important or something's complicated, I call. And not being able to participate in call queues because, hey, my cell phone's my office line now, right? So I think where we're seeing is there's this transition period that's happening where I need to buy a phone system. What's my phone system? I'm not really making many voice calls in my phone system anymore, so I don't need a ton of minutes. I think the next natural phase of this, some industry analysts like Dave Michaels call this like UC3, where mobility kind of really integrates. And it's basically what we talked about earlier with fixed mobile convergence. I think you're going to start to realize how many business minutes are used. It's just today it's kind of hidden because they're off to the side outside of managed infrastructure. But by merging these things together, you can get the best of both worlds. Your cell phone is your primary communications channel, but now I can do compliance. Now I can do, call queue distribution. Now I can do a variety of different things. I can hand calls off when I get back to my desk and, pick them up with a headset on my screen. So I think that's where a lot of organizations are thinking today. Again, the present, I'm looking at this saying, I don't need buckets and buckets and buckets and buckets of minutes. But where they're going to go really quick is once they see the value of mobility, they're going to realize, oh, we are actually making a lot of phone calls. The idea that voice is dead in an infrastructure is, I think, a myth. Voice isn't dead. It's just not a product anymore. It's a feature in a platform. It's not a platform in and of itself.
I think, I mean, you made a comment to the side of, what was it? It was something along the lines of, it's not a super exciting topic, like to paraphrase, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I mean, I think that becomes the like ultimate level of maturity for any piece of technology,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like the goal of technology really is to exist in the background where it's not thought of anymore. And when it disappears and it's completely out of the mindset, where it's just, it's like electricity. It's just supposed to work,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like you've hit like voice has been around for a long time, but we finally hit peak, maturity where people don't think about it. It's just an assumption it's going to work all the time. And now we're kind of getting into this, period of modalities of like what actually makes the most sense. I'm weird. I dial into most of my conference calls now. Like people send me, like Teams, whatever, meeting invites. And I really am annoyed at the ones where they haven't licensed the
Just
PSTN
dial in.
gateway for their dial-in, because then you have to join with Teams. But the other ones, if it's got an audio bridge on it, like I don't know, like 95% of the calls I'm joining just with audio. Like it's actually kind of nice, to I don't know, like maybe I'm old enough where I have this like romance around, like, not that they have any romance around calling it a conference bridges, but you know what I mean? Like it's just the experience is different. Like it's there's something exhausting about being on a video call all the time. And then you get into like the social dynamics of like you've joined a video bridge, but your video is turned off,
Mm-hmm.
or if your video is on, or like all these different things. Like there's different social pressure that comes from that.
Oh, 100%. 100%. And, you and I are both male. It's a lot harder to be female in this kind of a communications world because, to your point, I'm on stage as a guy, put a shirt on, do my hair, I'm ready to go, right? It's a whole different world, and I've had to be conscious of that a lot as a leader, um, understanding that what I need is your knowledge. I don't need your vision. Like I don't need to see you. I just need to talk to you. And having that kind of dial in, I'm seeing it just anecdotally. I'm seeing more and more folks that jump on bridges just audio only because I don't want to look at myself. And I don't necessarily need you to see me right now, right? Like I got a lot going on in my background. I got a lot happening in my house. And how can I help you? You know?
Yeah.
Um, and I think there's a key piece to that. And I think there's also been a lot of there's been a lot of written articles about video fatigue. And I think where the next phase comes is during the pandemic, video worked because we were all sitting at our desks. We were all on the same plane. We're all one video in a tile,
Yeah.
in a mosaic of tiles. So it was normalized. Everybody was on the same plane. But post pandemic, as people started going back to the offices, now there was an imbalance because the people that are collaborating in person obviously gain a benefit because if you've been a remote participant in one of those meetings where you're the only one that's working remote and everybody else is in the same conference room, you're dealing with audio issues, you're dealing with,
Yeah.
rustling papers and you can barely see people. And I think the next phase is going to be mobility when people start kind of getting back on the road and, I'm in the car, but it doesn't mean I'm not working. And in the old days, that was commonplace.
Yeah.
I just dial into the bridge. That's the whole terminology, right? And to your point, we've kind of swung so far in the other direction to where a lot of bridges don't even have the dial-in info anymore. How do you dial in from the car? Got to futz around with Teams, and I got to turn the video off because I can't let you see me driving. And so the PSTN still has a place as that kind of universal connector into all of these different things. But I think today's buyers are really starting to come around to voice for business communications is having its iPhone moment. And what I mean that is the iPhone iPod. Pre 2007, we all carried around Motorola Razors or some other type of smartphone. We carried around an iPod. We carried around a whole batch of other stuff. And then Apple unveiled this world where this is a new platform, i.e., a smartphone. And all of those things that used to be physical devices you bought became digitized apps on this new platform. And it's just the life cycle of technology. And voice, I think, is in that same place where a lot of organizations are, just call it what it is. They're looking for ways to cut costs, especially in telecom, because, hey, it's just telecom, right?
Yep.
And I think a lot of them are coming around to this idea that voice is becoming a feature in a platform. And those platforms are the collaboration platform you're using. So if you're a Teams shop, Teams phone makes sense. If you're a Zoom shop, Zoom phone makes sense. Frankly, if you're a WebEx shop, and it seems like they're having a resurgence now, WebEx is going to make sense.
The only place where I've heard, I mean, there's lots of, listen, I've got lots of examples of people that did not want to go completely into Teams. I'll just keep this conversation specific to Teams because I'll get too scattered.
Sure.
One of the most interesting ones I had was the company wanted to be able to separate their internal and external communications platform, and they wanted a really clean delineation. And this was not like, this was a while back, but it was a very interesting dialogue because it changed a lot of how like we approach things internally. Like, my team, right? Like, do you want, like convergence is good, and in some cases it's bad, and like all these different things.
Sure.
Now we can get into a philosophical conversation that's completely off the rails. Let's talk about migration and deployment, right? And you mentioned with Roseman, like, they had already made the decision to go to Teams. They wanted to go to an integrated platform. It's already deployed. I mean, and there's lots. I mean, look, if you've got Teams already on every desktop, it's really easy. You're already supporting the platform. Like, let's go ahead and voice enable it. I mean, it doesn't take. This isn't like rocket science kind of decision making process, right? But from that moment forward, at some point they had a conversation which was, okay, what happens to our user community, and do people need phones or not need phones, right? So that means they went out and they talked to people before this stuff. So I'm curious if you could kind of walk me through a little bit. Deployment. What's a good deployment? What's a bad deployment? What should people really be thinking about is before they start going down this path to, give them the best possible outcome in making the shift?
So I think there's a few things that you've got to keep in mind. And I was really impressed with the way Roseman handled their transition, because it wasn't just talking to people and figuring out like what desk phones did you need. And to answer your question simply, the bad deployments are the weekend cutovers. Like those just don't exist anymore, and they shouldn't exist anymore. And those were relics of the past. Those were relics of the premise-based phone system, because I wasn't going to come back 12 different weekends and cut over user by user, department by department, right? We're doing it this weekend. We're doing it live, right?
Yeah.
Roseman instantly saw this is going to have to be a gradual project. This is not going to be something that we do in a weekend. They got multiple campuses. They got limited resources. They just could not digest that level of disruption to the campus operations. And they didn't need to. We were able to turn on 5 seats instantly for them, and it showed the value of, hey, we can do this stuff gradual. You can add seat by seat as you need it. It's fully automated, so there's no infrastructure to go out and buy and procure and implement and deploy and whatnot. But then what they did is they said, who are our internal influencers? We all know them. They're the early adopters of new tech. They're the ones that get the new iPhone and you see it on their desk. Hey, how'd you like that? Or, what do you think? Or like, They're the ones driving the new EVs. What's it like driving an EV? How is that, right? What's range anxiety or anything else? So you find though, and every business unit, every department has these influencers in space that will be able to actively promote new technologies. So Roseman identified them and Roseman moved them to the platform, and Roseman created a feedback loop for these early adopters. As a manufacturer, we talk about the customer adoption bell curve. When you release a new product, you got to find your innovators, your early adopters. You create the feedback that lets you help, kind of the development cycle before you hit mass market. I think adopting that same approach as a business to deploying new technology is going to be a game changer, and it was for Roseman. So they went out, they found their promoters, their early adopters. They gave them the technology. They created a feedback loop, and that gave them the tools to kind of test and adjust to realize the adoption of this stuff is actually really easy because you're already using Teams to communicate internally. Now it's basically just there's a new button for phone, and when you want to call somebody that's not a part of the campus, you got a dial pad, you make that outbound call. But because you were already using the product, the adoption rate went really fast because it's just a new feature in Teams. This is great.
Right.
So then they took the next step. Once they had those early adopters, they started mapping out what regions those early adopters could influence, and they started moving those department by department to the new platform. So doing these kind of gradual death by a million paper cuts transitions enabled them to really kind of accelerate the momentum, because once they crossed a critical threshold, all of a sudden it became, hey, that department moved over to Teams. Can I get that? Because I'm sick of dealing with this desk phone or whatnot. So there was some of that at play. And then the third thing was what we talked about earlier. They were conscious of the reluctance from a lot of faculty, right? In a higher education institution, you deal with a lot of senior level professors and faculty that are kind of, to put it politely, set in their ways, and change is disruptive. Even if it's, even if I know you can handle this, right? If I take the training wheels off, I know you can ride the bike, but
yeah,
I want those training wheels on. And for a lot of the faculty, it was, you're taking my desk phone away from me. This is how I communicate with my students. And I don't want to talk through the computer, right? Give it 90 days. We're going to take them away. If you need it, we'll bring it back. And that kind of, I know you can handle it, let me kind of just give you a little push, really opened up a lot of eyes, because like the results speak for themselves. 90% of those desk phones are still in a closet because they weren't needed anymore.
there is a Wall Street Journal article I'm going to find and send to you, and anybody who's watching this, it's great. And I'm trying to think when it came out to make this easier, but the 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 gist of the article was, the phones have 50 million buttons on them. I don't know what any of them do, so I just take the phone off the desk and I put it into the drawer, and it's from a university, and it's an East Coast university. So I don't know if it was Columbia or NYU or Harvard. I mean, it was, like a tenured professor at a very high end elite university talking about how they can't figure out how to use their phones. They just got rid of it and they just shoved it in the desk. And it's so but you're right, like the change, there becomes a resistance to change, not because of anything else except just, I don't want to change. Like, I don't know what this means and I don't want to do it. And um I was laughing as you're telling the story because I'm like, oh wow, this makes so much sense. Like, you mean I don't want to start with the people that are going to be the most resistant to change? I'll give it to the people that actually don't want this in the first place and let them get it, and then let everybody else see it. Um, Now, but doing that kind of migration, we talk about this when we started off, talking about like hybrid deployments with direct routing, right? And direct routing as a service and going
Mm-hmm.
into Operator Connect. How, if you're doing that kind of migration where you're keeping your on-premise environment, in this case, they had an on-premise phone system, and then
Mm-hmm.
they had like one user in a department coming out of that environment. So you have their phone number, their DID coming out, or their TN coming out. But now you have to do other things, right? Because you have to maintain these bridges between these environments.
Um, Not really.
No,
No,
they
because
just
everybody's already got the new phone system on their desk. Because in Teams, you just call people internally. Most customers who haven't enabled the Teams phone capability are
so
calling each other internally in Teams anyway. It's
so
just
they were
a
already
Teams
using
call.
Teams. They weren't using phones to call each other.
No, they were just using Teams to call each other, and
Oh, so
increasingly
you're
we
just
see that
talking
more
about
and more.
internal to external dialing was being moved off the desk and going into Teams.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, the phone system is there, so you could pick up the phone and dial an extension to call somebody. But by and large, most people for the internal calling, it's just I'm in Teams. I just click the
Okay,
person
now
in
I'm
the
really
chat.
curious. So if somebody had dialed like the main number and spoke to a receptionist and
Mhm.
said, "I need to speak with Steve," and they were going to transfer the call, were they just creating islands at that point,
They
or
could have. We had a bridge built, so we have a bridge solution is what we call it. So we can actually integrate Prem with, Teams. So to operate in this kind of a hybrid environment. So in that kind of environment, yeah, you would want to have the two systems linked. But, primarily what a lot of organizations do is they keep kind of the customer facing pieces as the final pieces of the transition. And they move kind of the back of house stuff over. So like teachers, faculty, that type of thing. A lot of times they're disconnected from that type of an environment in general. But yeah, so if you plan it out and you kind of plot it out, you would keep your front of house stuff towards the back half of your gradual migration, or you implement a bridge solution. So while you're in that transition period, you have the ability to merge the two. And it's pretty straightforward to build. And we using our platform, we can actually support both environments with a unified dial plan, so you don't have to get in the middle of I'm still manage this legacy Cisco stuff. And I got to try and connect it over with Bridge. We just basically move all of that up to the cloud. So it's just a link to the old and a link to the new.
how long did it take them to migrate?
That's a great question. I don't actually know the full answer on how long it took to migrate over. I wasn't engaged at the on the back end of that.
Because I get the sense of like we're talking, not like a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, but more like a quarter, two
Correct.
quarters of migration.
Correct. Yeah,
Like
I don't know the exact number, but you're right. It wasn't measured in like 2 weeks, 3 weeks.
you said something earlier, I wrote down a note on. We started talking about text messaging,
Hmm.
um, and I'll again, you do a lot of international. I'm not going to talk. Let's. I'm going to try to keep like
Sure.
U.S. specific, right? I think most people in the U.S. that interact with text messages from their cell phone.
Hmm.
And, even though RCS is now being pushed into iPhone capability, right? You still have this like blue bubble versus green bubble experience with text messaging for most people,
Sure.
right? Especially if you're iPhone centric. Um, enabling enabling SMS within a phone system, a corporate phone system, you now have 10 DLC and you have 10 DLC issues that come out. And you
Hmm.
had also talked about, enabling WhatsApp. And that's right, why I wrote this down. I want to come back to it because WhatsApp is enormous internationally,
Hmm.
and anybody that does that has any international work has WhatsApp, on their phones.
Hmm.
But WhatsApp isn't a really big thing in the United States in terms of like business messaging per se. Now Meta wants to change that, but um, as companies are rolling these phone systems out, and especially when you start talking about teams, you know, is there big demand? I mean, are people trying to SMS enable all these devices? I mean, you have to put and have another app running, and there's a plugin that has to exist. I mean, Microsoft thankfully is going to start, is on the path of fixing this. I'm happy to hear that, but what, um, because that opens up yet another area, and I think of compliance as like the first one,
Hmm.
right? If you're in a compliance regulated industry, text messaging has to be saved and recorded. Like it can't exist on cell phones.
Yep. Well, and that's part of the reason why to deploy a business text messaging solution, because to paraphrase Jurassic Park, tech finds a way. You know, um, just because I say you can't do that, a lot of times we'll end up doing that. Even in my personal life, if I have a file that I've got to get to somebody, and for whatever reason my OneDrive's not letting me get it over to somebody, do I say no? I can't get it there. Like, no, I got to figure out a solution. And
Hmm.
for a lot of users in the field, the solution ends up, here's my cell phone numbers. This way we can text. And then it breaks all the loops because now you've got my cell phone number and whatnot.
Yeah.
Text is huge. And I think the problem is most organizations either A, don't have a clear understanding of how to do it because it's complicated. And then two, most of the providers really make it, I almost want to say unattractive. Like
Yeah.
even like with, some of the industry leaders, you get 100 text messages per month to use as a user. Like each user gets 100 text messages. And if I'm an IT leader, I'm looking at that going, this is the opposite of voice. Like voice, I don't know how many people are making so many minutes, but I know it's not a ton. Text, I am scared to death of what that bill would look like if I'm paying per text message. Because think about it. Hi,
Well, it's also
that's one.
circa 2000 sub-Sahara, like what are we doing here,
Yeah. I mean, hi, that's one message. How are
Yeah.
you? That's a second message. I can see the meter running really, really fast with my end
Well,
users.
and by the way, this is really inside baseball, but message length at this point will still show up as one message, but then you have a character limit that becomes a segment. So that becomes, long text messages, the wall of text,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's multiple text messages.
Agreed. So I think there's a lot of appetite for it in the market. I'm seeing more and more customers are looking at it, specifically in higher ed, because this is how, if PSTN was kind of the unique universal connector,
Mhm.
text messaging is becoming the universal connector to the student body.
Yeah.
And frankly, faculty. It's not just students that are text, faculty texts, admin texts. Everybody is communicating digitally.
Yeah.
So a lot of universities, specifically, Roseman adopted. They're early in stage, but they've adopted our text messaging partner, ClerkChat. They've adopted that solution, and we're seeing more and more demand for it. And the reason why we really love the Clerk solution and made it core of our offer is it does so much more than just text. It does SMS, MMS, so you can send a picture as well as a
Go
text.
figure. We'd never do that,
Back
right?
to 2025 or back to 2005.
Yeah.
But then it also supports WhatsApp Business. So for international students who live on WhatsApp, now all of a sudden the faculty and admin can embrace a connection to that. Um, they have some really interesting stuff around outbound campaigns. So you can, run alumni outreach. You can do fundraising through it, and your results are dramatically higher on outbound digital comms, text, WhatsApp,
Mhm.
whatever, versus outbound calling, to alumni to or other fundraising mechanisms. So we see more and more of it. And the thing we love about, our partnership with Clerk is their app is really elegant, but the other element of it is it's unlimited. It's not, here's 100 messages and then it's going to cost you this much per month. It's unlimited. So for a customer, I have that peace of mind. It's a fixed cost in my environment. I'm not sitting there going, can you please cut down on the number of text messages you're sending? And I've seen the lot, and and it integrates natively with all three platforms, Teams, Zoom, or WebEx. So no matter what platform a customer is using, it's covered. And the other really key point for us, I don't need you to move your voice to SIPPIO necessarily. So for us, I can give a customer that's keeping their voice on-prem, I can text message enable their numbers. So in Teams, they'll see, the text
Mm.
messages with those numbers while the phone service is still being delivered on-prem by another carrier. So that flexibility really is key to us to give customers that kind of use the Steve Jobs quote, a cold drink of water while you're stuck in hell. While you're stuck in that, on-premise infrastructure, I can't move off because it's, I've got contractual issues or whatever else. We can still add more capabilities to your existing environment. If you're using Teams, we'll give you text messaging there. We'll give you fax. So this way, you're enhancing your communications infrastructure without having to do everything all at once.
The legacy PBX players are not doing themselves any favors, right? Because we started this off and talking about like what drove this, and the cost and complexity of maintaining the system on site. I mean, just complexity, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have a specialized skill set in order to maintain these things, but you've already got an investment already. But then you look at licensing costs, hardware refresh cycles, software subscription, support subscription licenses. Like all these things, add up, and um, and it's I've seen this a lot of times where a provider will shoot themselves in the foot, coming into a renewal cycle thinking that they have an organization captive, and doing a little strong arm tactics, and the next thing you know, it's like, well, we just decided we don't want to be here anymore at all. and we're just going to, and especially if they have a disjointed, cloud platform approach, or a I mean, at this point, non-existent cloud platform approach. It's opening this thing wide up. Uh, I'm trying to think what else I want to ask you, Steve. I mean, we've talked about like it's, you
So, I
know,
mean, to that point, the opportunity in the market lies in prioritization. A lot of these legacy providers are clinging to complexity, as in it's going to be disruptive for you to leave this spider web that you've built with, the on-premise infrastructure at its middle. So you've got all these other IT prioritization or IT priorities. You've got, security, you've got these other things. You know what? Let's just leave let's leave that. Let sleeping dogs lie, right? That's where they're depending on. It's not that they're delivering new innovation. The licensing, they've got to, they're walking a tightrope because they've got to walk this tightrope of the laws of diminishing returns versus the increases in cost. They're not increasing value. There's no innovation happening on those systems. If anything, they're adding more strands to the spider web by trying to integrate with another UCaaS provider, right? What we see is tipping this with customers is when do you cross that line? What's the straw that breaks the back where this price increase now all of a sudden prioritizes this infrastructure? I haven't been dealing with it, not because I love it, but I haven't been dealing with it because I'm afraid of it. And now you've got me to the point where I'm looking at what else is out there. And once you get to that point, you kind of realize that the monsters under the bed aren't there. A lot of these platforms have pre-built integrations to the stuff that you're using. Most of your IT stack is probably cloud enabled, SFDC or HubSpot or Zendesk or some of these other things that you've built these integrations to, and you've convinced yourself that these are unrepeatable. I can't do this elsewhere. And then you look at something cloud based because something caused you. Usually it's that value versus cost versus priority discussion algebra there. Once you start looking at something else, it's like, oh man, I was afraid of this. And there was really, I don't want to trivialize it, but there was no real reason to fear this. Because in the past, I spent hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars getting those integrations working because it was, to a certain degree, the Wild West. Everything was built one by one, lots of pro services. In a cloud-based world, it's scalable because all that stuff is repeatable. It's all pre-built for you. So it's a matter of, if you're on that legacy infrastructure, I think every organization looks at it and says, this is on borrowed time. It's just a matter of how much time that is versus when you force me to look. And a lot of these organizations, these legacy companies are struggling. So they're trying to pass along increases to those end customers. Cause to your point, I think I've got you hostage. I think I've got you captive. And the reality of the situation is you really don't. I've got you hostage. You know, as long as you don't make this painful for me, as long as you don't, overstep your bounds, then I'm content to leave that as is because I got other things I'm trying to deal with. So it's actually the opposite. It's the customers have those vendors hostage, but they don't realize it.
Yeah, my brothers and I were talking about the Bane meme the other day. Do you feel in charge? That kind of thing.
Love it.
One of the things I like about SIPPIO, and you touched on this briefly, was how easy you make this to pilot and test this stuff.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little about that before we wrap here?
Yeah. So our core is that we want to make technology fast, easy, and flexible because it has not been that for decades. So we talked a little bit about our history. When we first launched with direct routing as a service, we looked at it and said, this is a science project. How do we make this easier? And it's basically guided our development all along. So today, we basically take pride in the fact that we don't have, you know, a really complicated customer experience tool. You know, it's like shopping on Amazon. There are 3 calling plans. You choose which one fits for you based off of how much usage you want or, what features you need to have bundled in. You click buy, and for some customers, you can just give us a credit card and off you go. And unlike the days of the past where I had to have professional services and somebody, manually provision your system, everything's fully automated. So if it's new phone numbers, you're up and running in literally minutes. We can push the new numbers up into the Teams tenant. Usually it's within 5 minutes. We're waiting on that acknowledgement back from Microsoft that they're there. And you're ready to assign the numbers and get going. So that gives us a lot of benefit for customers, is that simplicity. You're not dealing with a bill of materials that's 6 pages long of, zeroed out costs. And it's like, why are you putting this here? Some Siebel quote or SAP quote that has to account for every little widget. So the simplicity matters. The speed is crucial, to be able to say to somebody, here, I'm just going to give you 5 seats. Hold on. And they're in the system right away before the meeting ends, is really valuable. And then the other thing, especially for higher ed, a lot of times you're not in a homogenous environment. You're not going to have a singular platform like Roseman did. And even Roseman is still in the process of trying to kind of fight out some of the, third-party gremlins that are in there. But a lot of times you operate in a mixed environment. I may have some users that are on Teams. I may have some users that are using Zoom. That's their preference. So with our platform being able to support all of the leading, collaboration environments, the Teams, Zoom, and we're going to be onboarding WebEx here in the next couple of weeks, we don't force customers to choose, and we become a nexus point of connectivity. So you can move users from end to end. If you have somebody that, say you acquire a company in the business world, you make a merger and they're using Zoom phone, you can connect them in. So this way you don't have to port it a second time. And when you're ready, you can move those users gradually over to whatever environment, or you can leave them there and just manage it centrally. So for our customers, the simplicity of the platform, the scalability of the solution, I can support anybody from 1 seat all the way up to, 2-3 million seats in a customer. Sorry, dog started barking. I can support 2 or 3 million seats on a customer because I'm Azure native. I don't have to go out and buy servers to support somebody. Gives us the ability to serve them. And then the global network, I can give you the simplicity of one hand to shake and one bill to pay for coverage in over 82 countries around the world. So if you have remote users, if you've got a branch office somewhere, I can get you service where a lot of others can't.
Fast, easy, flexible. What a line! I love it. I'm going to use that and steal it for myself. I'm sorry, but I'm announcing it publicly, so at least everybody knows where it came from.
There you go.
Steve, thank you very much for the time.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Max.
It's fantastic. I love your background, by the way. I was
Thank you.
I'm really jealous, actually. So
yeah, it's a properly decorated office. Doesn't need virtual backgrounds.
No, I love it. It's fantastic. It's, like I said, I'm part of me is jealous. So maybe in the future we'll see a change over here.
Sounds good.
Steve, thank you very much.
Thank you.